Steve, did you have any quick responses before I ask for questions? You don't have to.
No, hey, by the way, Rehan, have you ever seen the work by Borjas where he looks at the last great wave of immigrants? He looks at the groups that are least educated in 1910, and then he looks at their descendants or grandkids in 1970, and he finds a pretty strong correlation that the groups that were least educated in 1910 did the worst, and the groups that were most educated by 1970 did the best. And it's very complicated to do that kind of thing, and the data is limited, but it certainly supports a lot of what you were pointing out.
I have seen it, and I think that it's certainly contested, and people debate about this, but what I will say is that when you look at lots of pro-immigration scholars and advocates, what they will often say is that less skilled immigration has no impact on natives. In fact, they will claim that it has a positive benefit on the wages of natives. Now, again, when you're looking at this positive impact, it's actually quite trivial in most cases. But what they tend to neglect is that there is pretty much no dispute that new less skilled immigrants put intense pressure on the wages of older less skilled immigrants. And I think that the idea that we can just put that to the side is very strange when 15% of the US workforce is foreign-born. It's very disproportionately less skilled. And this is literally the biggest integration challenge that we face in this society. So I think that even if you bracket that kind of finding, which I happen to find very interesting and useful and worthwhile, but even if you bracket that, the people who are the advocates are relying on scholarly work that makes it unambiguously clear that it's actually previous less skilled immigrants who are challenged. So I think that that's something that, again, something that no one disputes.
Yeah, in fact, I was once on a radio show with Giovanni Perri who makes that argument. Essentially, he put out a study saying, look, immigration doesn't have that much impact on less educated natives in California, but to get to that result, it had to reduce the natives of like high school dropouts who are foreign-born, who make up most of the high school dropouts in the state, and a lot of them are legal. They had to reduce their wages by 17%. But he said, but it made everyone else a little bit richer, so that was okay. And it was amazing. He would just defend that position. It seemed very odd.
And by a little bit, I mean, again, we need to keep in mind how small these numbers are and how, frankly, their numbers, well, yeah.
Any questions? We have a microphone. I have a question while you guys are thinking of questions. This is maybe more for Robert, because Rehan may just dismiss people who make this argument as kooks, which they kind of are. But there's this libertarian argument. Tom Bethel made it years ago. Alex Narasta at Cato makes it now, that it's actually good to have very high rates of immigrant welfare use because it will destroy the welfare system. In other words, it's sort of a Leninist worse is better kind of, and I mean, it's not a joke. They actually sort of seem to be seriously making this argument. I just wondered if Robert or anybody, Rehan, had any thoughts on that.
It reminds me of a couple of old leftists, Fox and Piven, who basically tried to bring down New York City by swamping the welfare system about way back in the early 1970s. Didn't work. Just made New York City a lot less livable. It's it's just goofy. The point more is that they like to play these games to try to pretend that reality doesn't exist. For example, they will say, oh, well, you have all these surveys that show that what immigrants get in welfare, but immigrants don't get welfare because we barred that in 1996. And I was involved in writing that law, and I testified at the time. I said, look, it's okay to put this 5-year time limit. You can't get food stamps for the first 5 years you're here. You can't get TANF and so forth. But essentially, this is de minimis. It's essentially a joke, guys. I know you like to joke with the taxpayer, but this is a joke, okay? Because, in fact, means-tested welfare is, in fact, a lifetime stream of benefits that if you're young and you have children, you get TANF maybe, but you get slightly older, you're still getting food stamps, you still may be getting Medicaid. You get slightly older than that, you're likely to become disabled, get SSI. And so that benefit stream goes on. It doesn't stop. And putting a 5-year time limit has, you can see, absolutely de minimis, no really measurable effect at all. Okay, and then I love the deeming thing. I mean, conservatives find this this remarkable provision, well, if you're a public ward, you can be deported. I've been in the welfare field for close to 40 years. I have yet to see anyone deported on that provision in the entire welfare state, but it doesn't matter because, we can raise that thing. The reality is that it's bizarre what the libertarians do, because the type of analysis that I do and that Steve is doing, when libertarians look at it, when they look at my analysis, and I have a paper coming out next week where I use this same sort of analysis, the total benefits received by population, total taxes paid, it's called fiscal incidence is the technical term, and I don't look at it in terms of immigration, I look at it just in terms of rich people versus poor people, and I show what, the bottom 20% take this much and pay that much. This is how much that shows that there's $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion transferred from the top to the bottom. I presented that in front of libertarians from Cato and elsewhere. As long as it's just in that bland sense, I say, oh yeah, this is great analysis. Look at how big the welfare state. Look at it. But immediately you put the word immigration in it, and it's the least competent research ever performed by a conservative. The guy is a scandalous liar. It's exactly the same thing. It's exactly the same thing. And the bottom line is, as I said earlier, it's very simple. If in fact a person who is at the bottom that doesn't have a high school degree, as Cato would contend, produces all these externalities that compensate for that $1.5 trillion in transfers, why isn't the same thing true for a person that's born in Kentucky or Illinois or something? They're the same low-skilled workers. They're very, very similar. In effect, what they want to do is, they'd love to get rid of the welfare state, but they at least want to pretend that it doesn't exist, and in order to facilitate the ideology of open borders.
I would like to weigh in on this. I believe that, if anything, the opposite is likely to be the case. Now, one of the findings that is oftentimes touted by immigration advocates is that if we look at Denmark, this is a society where we've seen the upgrading of skills of less skilled natives in response to less skilled immigration. Now, what people fail to understand about the Danish example is that Denmark went through a period of absorbing a large number of refugees, many of them from the former Yugoslavia and from the Horn of Africa. What then happened, incidentally, is that having absorbed this population, then the Danes embraced a very restrictive immigration policies. And by the way, they're embraced on the political right, but also on the political left in Denmark. But this upgrading of the less skilled natives did not, in fact, happen automatically. Now, this is a kind of difficult thing for many of our friends in the libertarian right to appreciate. But what in fact happened is that, going back to Baumo's disease, there were extremely labor-intensive interventions by social workers and various other professionals in Denmark who worked with less skilled natives to actively upgrade their skills. It's also worth noting that while it is indeed true that less skilled immigrants can be complements for less skilled natives in some cases, which is the usual argument deployed by economists who are doing this work, by immigration advocates, etc., that is not in fact true for everyone. In a society like ours, there are indeed some less skilled natives who are going to be able to capitalize on the opportunities presented to them by a large number of less skilled immigrants. But there are also others who suffer from social, cognitive, and a variety of other deficits, where they are not able to respond quite so easily. And if they're going to respond, again, you're dealing with very expensive interventions. So if anything, when you have the kind of displacement of part of the less skilled native population, you are likely to need more welfare spending rather than less. It is welfare spending of a different kind, indeed welfare spending of a kind that you could describe as more intrusive, more involved. There's a woman, Toby Herr, of Project Match, and she's done this fascinating work for years and years on trying to facilitate the transition from welfare to work. And one thing that she's found is that even with the best financed programs, with the most involved interventions, what she finds is that a year after the intervention, only about half of the people who took part in this extremely expensive, involved program are actually still attached full-time to the labor force. upgrading the skills of people who are part of the marginalized poor is extremely difficult. And I think that as you increase the numbers of people who fall in this category, again, you're not just talking about immigrants, but you're also talking about displaced natives. This might not be a majority of natives, it's not going to be all natives, but it is a non-trivial number of people to whom we have, in my view, a profound social obligation. So I think that this view is simply naive. The point at which you're going to break the system is the point at which we're going to have a series of political clashes and tensions that are going to be about a lot more than the welfare state, and I'm not sure if we want to actually make that gamble.
Yes, if you could identify yourself too, please.
I'm Allie Meyer. I'm a reporter with the Washington Free Beacon. My question is regarding, I think you kind of touched on it a little bit, but last week the jobs numbers came out, the BLS, and they have the number of employed foreign-born workers, which includes, they don't distinguish between illegal immigrants and legal, and then the native-born, and they found that the number of foreign-born employed people has gone up while the native-born has gone down, and now the unemployment rate for foreign-born workers is lower than the unemployment rate for native-born. So just wondering if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, in my other life, as someone who looks at the labor market a lot, there are very troubling trends in the U.S. labor market. If you looked at the period 2000 to 2014, although the native-born accounted for 2/3 of the growth in the working age, 16 to 65, say, you could do it 18 to 65, wouldn't make much difference. They didn't get any of the net gain in employment between those 2 years. Now, obviously, it goes up and down. It vacillates with the economy. Things have got a little better since the middle of 2014. But what we can say is that a disproportionate share of jobs relative to their fraction of the population, relative to their share of the growth in the working age, has been going to the foreign-born. What's been happening is that the native-born, particularly the less educated, just work less and less. The other thing about the native-born, the less educated, say only a high school education or less than a high school education, they earn less when they do work. Now, if immigration was a really good deal for the less educated in the United States, you would have expected the last 10, 20, 30 years to be really a boon time for the less educated, because the immigrant share of the U.S. population almost tripled from 1980 to now. But it's been one of the worst periods ever for the less educated. So if immigrants who are less educated really do help less educated natives, we don't see that. When you look at the big picture anyway. It's been a disaster, right? I mean, their wages are down 10, 20%. The fraction holding a job has declined 5, 10, 15 percentage points. The majority of high school dropouts in the United States who are of working age don't work anymore. Those with only a high school education work a whole lot less. So we have an explosion of non-work. So
They'd say it would be worse.
yeah, maybe that's right. Immigration made it better, so that although there was this massive downturn for these folks, so that's the argument you'd have to make. But on its face, that's not what you see in the data, and you have to make some pretty big assumptions to argue that a less educated native and a less educated immigrant don't compete. And the fact is that it's really hard to make that argument for, say, the 1 million native-born people who work as maids and housekeepers in the United States, who compete with roughly 900,000 immigrants. In other words, that occupation is almost half. It's kind of hard to make that argument for the 1 million, or roughly something like that, 800,000 Americans who work in meat and poultry processing, who compete with a similar number of immigrants. They seem to be doing exactly the same job. They seem to have similar skills. So, as Rehan said, you can have a mixed situation, right? You can have a situation where some Americans clearly benefit from immigration and some are made worse off. And the problem with our immigration system seems to be the ones who are being made worse off seem to be the least educated and poorest to begin with.
I think it's good to emphasize that in almost every field, every occupation where illegal immigrants are prevalent, there are a large number or majority of the workers in that field are native-born, and they're competing with that. It's just ridiculous. So where is this labor market segmentation that occurs? And moreover, even if it does occur, let's say that somehow, in period X, large numbers of drywall hangers in construction were native, and now they're not. Well, the drywall hangers that were native had to go someplace, and let me tell you, they didn't go and get a degree in dentistry or something like that, which is what a lot of these studies would imply. They went over, and now they're competing in low skill carpentry or something like that. And because of that, you basically see a pretty bleak picture for the lower skilled, particularly lower skilled male workers looking over the last 20 years. You see a lot of people dropping out of the labor force. You don't see, in my mind, any of this indication of this, this boon that's come to them through immigration. In fact, the effects seem to be the opposite, and they're what you would expect.
Well, it's kind of like communism. It works. It just hasn't really been tried yet. Anyway, any other questions? Okay. Well, yeah, Don. Well, wait for the mic.
I think this is a very enlightening panel for me, and I've learned a lot. I'm a writer, and I have been writing a lot about another aspect which is not brought up this morning. And I just finished reading a fascinating book by a well-researched author named John Gresham, who wrote a book called Gray Mountain, which talks about the really poor people in the country. And I think as you go along, when you add the issue of automation to this whole mix, you're going to find that there's a confluence here of really dangerous proportions. And when you talk about $1 trillion a year in excess costs, I think it's going to be very fascinating to see where this goes. There's a cross-section here, and I think the majority of American people understand where we are in a very loose sense. They don't come nearly to the level of sophistication that's been expressed by this outstanding panel this morning. But they're getting it in various ways, and I applaud you for that. Thank you.
If I could just jump in on that. 10 years ago, the phrase that was used is that illegal immigrants are doing the jobs that Americans won't do. Now, that was insulting and false 10 years ago, all right? It's insulting to millions of American workers, all right? It is. Just amazing. But nobody says that anymore because you have this massive underemployment rate among low and moderate skilled workers, and it's preposterous to say, oh, these people won't, work in hotels. They won't be waitresses. They won't work in construction. It was ridiculous, in the around 2005. It's really, really ridiculous today. But my other field is welfare. And so I have this schizophrenia that I've experienced in the left really for about 15 years. Because when you're talking immigration, the mantra is, oh, these are jobs that Americans won't do. It doesn't displace any, everything is fine. We need these workers because we have all these empty jobs that have to be filled by this flow of legal or illegal low-skill immigration. And then I'll go to the next room where I'll be talking about, say, the inner city, or black families, okay? Now, for the left, the black family is in terrible trouble. 70% of black children are born outside of wedlock. Most good researchers would indicate that's a really bad problem. And the reason, the iconic reason is that there are not enough jobs for low-skilled black males, and because they don't have jobs and they have low wages, that means that's why there's such a low, and it's also happening to Hispanics and it's happening to whites, and the real problem is not enough jobs. So in the same time that we say, look, we have all these low-skilled jobs that are open, we have to bring in all this labor from abroad, you just change the format a little bit, and the main problem for low-skilled families in the United States is there not enough jobs for the fathers. You got to have one or the other, okay? And the data is pretty clear that there are jobs there, but the wages aren't going up. And the last thing you would want to do if you're trying to help low-skilled families, if you're trying to help families in the inner city, is push down the wages of low-skilled male workers. I mean, it's like the worst idea you could possibly have. But that's, in effect, what I think we're doing.
If
Do you
I-
see the level of inner city violence as related to that?
Well, I mean, there is research, I can show it to you, where people have tried to look at the question of whether the presence of immigrants increases in labor market stress in a city, and that increases crime. There are two studies that say yes. I mean, it's a very complicated question. But can I just say this? I don't think it's important to state that that immigration is by no means, in my view, the only problem that the less educated face in the United States. They are facing, remember, 40% of all American workers don't have, this is native born, have no education beyond high school, right? I mean, there's a lot of people who don't have a lot of education. Probably everyone in this room, most people are college educated. But that's not true. That's nowhere near the average in the United States. They face a lot of problems, right? International trade, technology has worked against them. But if it's correct, which I think the data, everyone agrees that they've not done well. Wage-wise, the rates of work, labor force participation, the benefits package they get, everybody agrees the less educated, they've really taken it on the chin. So the question is, a lot of things we don't have much control over, the pace of technology. Now maybe trade, globalization is hard to do anything about. You can't stop the Japanese from setting up factories in Malaysia. But immigration is something we can control. So it does seem exceedingly unwise to flood the unskilled labor market or the less educated labor market. But again, it's not the only problem that they face. But this would seem to be a problem that we could avoid with a more sensible immigration system.
And Steve has also done very good and careful work on the crime question in particular, and I will just say that there are a lot of ambiguities, and there are certainly some scholars who believe that it might have actually reduced crime levels, so I think that, there are definitely varying opinions on this. What I'll just say about the larger question you ask is that, to answer this puzzle that Robert raised, how can it be that you have this paucity of jobs for less skilled African-American men while you have, other people who are entering the low end of the labor market, finding employment opportunities, et cetera? There's a sociologist at UCLA, Roger Waldinger, who's done a lot of fascinating work on this, and part of what he's found is that people identify job opportunities, and by the way, this is not just for immigrants, but this is for everyone, through their social networks, and for immigrants, it's often through their ethnic networks. Now, what often happens is that you'll see the emergence of an ethnic niche in a particular industry. So there are coordination issues that arise in any workplace, and if I enter a workplace, and if I, let's say, speak Bengali, as my parents do, and as I do, then it would make sense to have an entire workplace of other Bengali speakers. And of course, you're going to have different ethnic niches, different, you could say, ethnic monopolies in different sectors and different regions. Now, that's not going to be a very inviting environment. If I'm an African-American man, for example, it might make the coordination somewhat more challenging, but that's kind of one of these dimensions that actually contributes to this larger picture. And another thing that I want to focus on, and this isn't so much about race, although it certainly is related to it, is the position of ex-offenders. There's a woman, Becky Pettit, who's written a wonderful book called Invisible Men about the ways in which we arguably overstate the extent of black economic progress by discounting the disproportionate role played by people who are ex-offenders and the challenges they encounter in the labor market. There's been a recent effort to, for example, ban the box, that is to prevent employers from asking their employees if they've ever been incarcerated. Because there's this perception that there's large-scale discrimination against these individuals. Now, the thing is that, this is an ethnographic question that I cannot answer definitively for you, but it is certainly a kind of widely held belief. If an employer has an option of hiring a less skilled immigrant or a less skilled native ex-offender, would they prefer to hire the immigrant or the ex-offender? Now, could it be that if you tighten the labor market and if I do not have the option of hiring a less skilled immigrant, might I be somewhat more inclined to hire someone who's an ex-offender, somewhat more inclined to give them the economic opportunity? Now, again, I cannot give you a definitive answer to that question, but I do think that as a matter of logic, it makes sense that I might be more inclined to give such a person an opportunity, or also members of any stigmatized group. Stigmatized groups, kind of suffer from this discrimination, and there's often the sense that I would prefer hiring anyone rather than a member of this stigmatized group. And lo and behold, when that's your only option, you might start giving such people economic opportunities and the opportunity to climb the ladder. And I think that there's some value in that. I think there's a lot of value in that.
Okay, I want to respect people's time. We're going to wrap it up now. Thank you for everybody for coming. We're going to have the video of this on our site, cis.org, probably next week, Monday. So thank you, Steve, obviously, for doing this work, Rayhan and Robert for commenting, and thank all of you for coming.